People believe the most powerful men can see through any secret from a mile away. But the truth is, the saddest secrets usually hide in plain sight behind a polite smile, behind a quiet figure wiping down tables every night. Enzo Caruso learned that on a rain-soaked Tuesday night in Chicago. At 34, he stood at the head of an empire the whole city only dared to mention in whispers. People feared the name Caruso before they ever met the man who carried it. But his empire never ran on fear, it ran on observation. The hesitation before an answer, the forced smile in a meeting, the employee who suddenly volunteers to stay late every single night. That night, long after closing, he returned to Il Faro, the restaurant his late father had left behind, to retrieve a folder from his second-floor office. He believed the building was empty, until he heard it, drifting out of the darkened kitchen. Not loud sobbing, just one breath catching in a throat, the sound of someone trying with everything they had not to be heard. Through the half-open door, he saw Callie Sutton, the shyest waitress in the restaurant, sitting alone in the dark, both hands covering her face, while her phone lit up on the floor again and again, with calls she never answered. And when she looked up, quickly wiped her tears, and smiled and said she was fine. Enzo Caruso, a man who had survived 1,000 lies, knew he had just heard the saddest one of his life. What he didn't know yet was that behind that lie lay a secret that would pull him into the most dangerous game he had faced in 10 years. If stories that touch the heart like this one mean something to you, please hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Don't forget to share this video with someone you care about, and leave a comment below to let us know which city you're listening from tonight. The next morning, Il Faro opened its doors as it did every day, and Enzo Caruso sat at the corner table on the second floor, looking down at the restaurant from the place where he often sat whenever he wanted to watch his father's establishment come alive. But that morning, he wasn't looking at the ledgers. He was watching a person. The night before, after Callie had left, he had stood for a long time in the darkened kitchen, where the echo of her choked sobs seemed to linger in the air. A man who survived by observing others couldn't ignore something so unusual, and so he began doing what he did best. He remained silent, and he paid attention. The first thing he noticed was that Callie Sutton never turned down a shift. When the manager needed someone to take a split shift, her hand went up before the question had even been finished. When someone had to stay late and close the restaurant, she accepted the task quietly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The other employees went home to their families, their friends, and the dinners waiting for them. Callie stayed behind, wiping tables that were already clean and rearranging silverware that was already perfectly aligned. People called it dedication, but Enzo had spent 34 years among people who concealed all manner of things beneath ordinary appearances, and he knew there was a very thin line between loving one's work and being afraid to leave it. The second thing he noticed was the phone. It stayed inside the pocket of her apron, and every time it vibrated, her entire body froze for a fraction of a second, so briefly that no one else in the restaurant noticed. No one except him. She never looked at the screen. She simply took it out, placed it face down on the nearest tray, and continued carrying food to the tables with the same polite smile that never shifted. Once, twice. By the third time in the same evening, Enzo understood that it was no longer a habit. It was a form of self-defense. But the moment that truly made him see her differently happened on Saturday night, at table number 9 beside the window. Table number 9 belonged, in a way, to an elderly woman with silver hair who came alone every weekend, ordered the same bowl of soup, and sat watching the street through the glass. Callie was always the one who served her. She remembered that the woman liked her soup a little hotter than usual, and that she needed an extra napkin beneath her water glass. That evening, when the old woman rose to leave, she left a $50 tip on the table, folded in half, and tucked beneath the bread plate. Enzo saw it from the second floor. He also saw Callie stand motionless before the bill for longer than necessary. $50. For a waitress working the evening shift, it wasn't a small amount. For someone he had begun to suspect was struggling, it might have paid for several meals. She picked up the bill, and in that moment, Enzo thought he understood how the scene would end. But she did something he hadn't expected. She hurried after the old woman to the coat rack near the entrance, gently held her coat while she slipped it on, and with a movement so quick that even the woman herself didn't notice, Callie slid the folded bill back into her coat pocket. Then she said something that made the old woman laugh, wave goodbye, and step out into the Chicago night. Callie returned to clear table number 9 as though nothing had happened. Enzo sat perfectly still on the second floor. He had known men who would betray one another for far less money. He had signed million-dollar contracts with people whose greed showed in every handshake. And yet, downstairs in his restaurant, a young woman who was clearly going without had quietly returned $50 to an elderly lady simply because she believed the woman had made a mistake. A poor person, without greed, his father had once said, is the rarest kind of person in this world. From that night on, Enzo's attention toward Callie was no longer merely the caution of an owner confronted with something unusual. It became a question that kept him awake. What could someone so decent be running from? Then he noticed the third thing, the smallest of them all, yet the one that haunted him most. Every night before leaving, Callie stopped by the kitchen and asked for whatever leftover food was about to be thrown away. The final pieces of bread from the day, the soup remaining at the bottom of the pot. She always asked in a hesitant voice, as though apologizing for being a bother. And she always gave the same explanation. She said she was taking it home for the neighbor's cat. The chef nodded and wrapped it for her, and no one asked another question. But Enzo stood on the second-floor staircase, watching her hold that paper container against her chest as though it were something precious. And he thought of the shadows beneath her eyes, the way her body had grown thinner beneath her uniform, and the way she had stood so still before that $50 bill. He said nothing. He simply remembered, the way he always remembered every piece of a puzzle before the entire picture finally came into view. That night, when the last lights of Il Faro went dark and the small figure of the young woman disappeared at the far end of the rain-slicked street, Enzo Caruso stood beside his office window for a very long time. 10 years of running an empire had taught him something no school ever could. People who are hiding something are often the hardest workers of all, because only when their hands never stop moving can they briefly forget the weight pressing down upon their shoulders. That Friday night, Il Faro was packed with customers. The sound of silverware touching porcelain, wine pouring into glasses, and laughter rising from weekend dinner tables blended into the familiar rhythm Enzo had heard since childhood, from the days when his father still stood behind the bar and made coffee with his own hands for the regulars. On crowded nights like that, Enzo came down to the first floor, not to supervise, but because of an old habit. His father had once told him that a healthy restaurant had a heartbeat of its own, and its owner had to know how to listen to it. That night, Il Faro's heartbeat was steady and warm, until the moment it shattered with the sound of glass. Callie was carrying a tray of wine glasses past the bar when the phone inside her apron pocket began to vibrate. That was all. A faint vibration buried beneath 100 other sounds. But Enzo saw her shoulders collapse as though she had taken an invisible blow, saw the hand holding the tray falter for half a beat, and watched the outermost glass slip over the edge and fall straight onto the stone floor. The sound wasn't loud. In a crowded restaurant, a broken glass was so ordinary that most of the diners only glanced over for a second before returning to their meals. But Callie's reaction wasn't ordinary at all. She dropped to her knees and began gathering the shards with her bare hands, apologizing over and over to anyone standing nearby, to the bartender's assistant, to the guest 3 steps away, even to the empty air in front of her. Her voice grew more frantic with every word. "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry. I'll pay for the glass. Please don't take it out of anyone else's shift. It was my fault." Her hands were trembling so badly that a shard nearly sliced into her palm. And still she kept apologizing, as though breaking a $2 glass were an unforgivable crime. Enzo had seen countless employees break things over the years. Some laughed awkwardly, others muttered in frustration at themselves. But no one had ever apologized like that, in the manner of someone who had once been viciously condemned for mistakes even smaller than this one. Someone who had learned by heart that every error had to be paid for with humiliation. That kind of reflex wasn't formed inside a restaurant. It had been taught somewhere else, by someone else. He stepped forward before the manager could speak, bent down, picked up the largest shard, placed it on the tray, and said in the calmest voice he could manage, "A glass can be replaced." Callie looked up at him, her hazel eyes widening as though he had spoken in a language she had never heard before. For 1 second, he saw something in those eyes that was sadder than the tears from the night before, the bewilderment of someone who wasn't accustomed to forgiveness. Then she lowered her head, whispered her thanks, and stood to continue her shift, though her shoulders remained rigid. It was as she rose that the phone inside her apron lit up again, and this time, through the thin fabric of the half-open pocket, Enzo saw the screen. For only a brief moment, before she managed to turn it face down, he read a name, Wade. No last name, No photograph, only 4 cold letters against the glowing screen, and beneath them, a notification showing 17 missed calls. 17 calls in a single evening. Enzo returned to the corner table, but his mind no longer remained with the heartbeat of the restaurant. A man's name calling 17 times wasn't calling to ask how someone was doing. It was a name that made the person receiving those calls drop a glass and kneel before the whole world to beg forgiveness. He had seen fear wear many faces, the fear of a debtor before a creditor, the fear of a traitor before discovery. But the fear on Callie's face belonged to something else, the kind of fear that had lived beside a person for so long that it had become part of the body itself. That night, Callie was once again the one who stayed behind to close. When the final guest had left, and the larger lights were being switched off one by one, Enzo was upstairs preparing to leave, when he saw her pass the long row of front windows, the familiar food container held against her chest, her steps carrying her toward the main entrance. Then she stopped. She stopped in the truest sense of the word, like a piece of film frozen in the middle of a scene. Enzo followed the direction of her gaze through the glass to the street across from the restaurant. A black pickup truck was parked against the opposite curb, positioned between 2 pools of streetlight, so that it nearly disappeared into the darkness. Its headlights were off. The engine wasn't running. No one got out. It simply sat there, silent and patient, in a way no accidentally parked vehicle ever did. Callie stood motionless before the window for the span of 3 breaths. Then her right hand rose to her chest, her fingers finding the small silver necklace she wore every day and closing tightly around the pendant, as though it were something keeping her from drowning. She stepped back once, then again, before turning toward the kitchen, toward the rear exit that opened into the narrow alley. She left the restaurant through the back door, even though her bus stop was directly outside the front entrance. Enzo stood beside the second-floor window, without turning on the light, staring down at the black pickup truck. He remained there, as still as the vehicle itself, locked in a contest of patience that only he knew was taking place. Nearly half an hour passed before the pickup finally started, rolled slowly away, and disappeared into the stream of Chicago's nighttime traffic. Enzo stayed where he was for a long while after it vanished. In this city, he knew better than most. Some vehicles parked because they were waiting to pick someone up, and others parked only to make certain someone knew they were being watched and waited for. On Saturday morning, before even the first produce suppliers knocked on Il Faro's back door, Gideon Rourke was already seated in the second-floor office. He was in his 50s, with closely cropped salt and pepper hair, the straight posture of a former soldier, and he was the only person in the world who could enter that room without knocking. Gideon had served the Caruso family since Enzo's father was still alive, had stood beside that hospital bed all those years ago, and had taught the teenage Enzo his first lesson about power, that the person shouting the loudest in the room was usually the weakest person in it. 30 years in his profession had given him a rare ability. He could tell when his employer had summoned him because of business, and when it was because of something heavier than business. This morning belonged to the second kind. Enzo poured 2 cups of coffee, pushed one across the desk, and spoke without preamble. There's an evening waitress downstairs named Callie Sutton. There's a man named Wade who is frightening her. And there's a black pickup truck parking across the street at night. I want the truth, nothing but the truth. Gideon took a sip of coffee and asked a single question. How far are the limits? Enzo looked toward the window where he had stood for nearly half an hour the night before. No one touches anyone. No one learns they're being investigated. No threats, no confrontation, and not a single shadow close enough for either her or that man to notice. I need the truth untouched, before anyone's fear has a chance to distort it. Gideon nodded, but remained seated for one more beat before asking the question only a man who had known Enzo since boyhood would have dared to ask. In what capacity are you doing this? As the owner of a restaurant, or as a man? Enzo was silent for a long time. Then he answered with the words his father had carved into him long before he was old enough to understand their full meaning. Anyone who works beneath a Caruso roof is protected by the Caruso family. My father never allowed a single exception, and I don't intend to become the first. Gideon set down his coffee, rose from the chair, and left the office without a sound, exactly as he had entered it. 3 days later, a brown envelope rested neatly on Enzo's desk before the restaurant opened. It wasn't thick. Important truths rarely required much paper. Enzo sat down, opened the envelope, and began reading in the early light slanting through the second-floor window. The first page carried a full name: Wade Mercer, 33 years old, former sales representative for a liquor distributor, dismissed more than a year earlier. No criminal record, no current employment. But the line that made Enzo's finger stop against the paper appeared near the bottom of the page. Gambling debt. The amount was so large that an unemployed man could never have repaid it. Borrowed through nameless underground channels, the kind that didn't send overdue notices but sent men directly to the door. A penniless man with no job and an enormous hidden debt. Yet every night he somehow had enough money to fill the tank of a pickup truck and enough time to sit for hours outside a restaurant. Something in that picture didn't fit, like a false note inside a piece of music. And Enzo had lived long enough to know that false notes were never accidental. The second page contained a surveillance record. The black pickup truck had appeared outside Il Faro for 6 consecutive nights, always arriving after the busiest hours, always parking in the same shadowed place between 2 pools of streetlight, always leaving after the final employee had gone home. 6 nights. That meant it had been there even before the rainy night, when Enzo heard Callie crying in the kitchen. It had been there during the nights when he hadn't yet known that Callie Sutton's fear even existed, patient and regular as a ritual. The third page made his jaw tighten. It contained several images taken from the security camera of a shop near the bus stop, 2 blocks from the restaurant, recorded 10 days earlier. In the photographs, Wade Mercer stood directly in Callie's path at the shelter, one hand braced against the glass advertisement panel, narrowing the space around her in a way any man would understand was deliberate. Callie, captured in the blurred image of a street camera, was stepping backward, both arms clutching her purse against her chest like a fragile shield. The final photograph had been taken as the bus arrived. She hurried aboard while the man stood watching her with both hands in his pockets, unhurried, like someone who had simply completed one more task in his day. Enzo set the photographs down, leaned back in his chair, and stared out at the gray Chicago morning. One question kept returning to him, tapping against his mind like water dripping in the night. A young woman who had been followed for weeks, blocked in the street, and called 17 times in a single evening, would ordinarily go to the police. That was what anyone would do. Yet Gideon's file contained no mention of a report, an emergency call, or a request for a protective order. Nothing at all. She endured it in silence, changed her route home by leaving through the back door, turned her phone face down on a tray, and cried alone in a dark kitchen. People only refuse to call for help when they believe their cry will be useless, or worse, when they believe it will make everything more dangerous. What had caused a young woman so gentle to lose faith even in the doors that were supposed to exist for the purpose of protecting her? The answer wasn't inside this envelope, but Enzo knew it existed, and he knew he would find it. He turned to the final page. There was only one line, concise and dry, like every report Gideon had ever written. Callie Sutton's current address. A month-to-month studio apartment on the 2nd floor above a laundromat on the west side of the city. Enzo stared at that line for a long time. For the past 14 months, she had traveled back and forth between one of the most elegant buildings in River North and a cramped room above a laundromat, carrying containers of leftover food and a secret she shared with no one. He folded the file, placed it inside a locked drawer, and sat motionless as the office slowly filled with warmth and the sounds of another day beginning below. The untouched truth he had requested had turned out to be only the surface. What lay beneath it, he could sense with the same instinct that had kept him alive for the past 10 years, was far deeper and far colder than anything those 6 pages could hold. It happened on Wednesday evening, just as the restaurant was settling into its busiest rhythm. Enzo was seated at his usual table on the 2nd floor, reviewing a contract with a wine supplier, when he heard a metal tray crash onto the stone floor from the kitchen below. Not the sharp shattering of glass from the week before, but a heavy clatter followed by the scrape of a chair and someone calling Callie's name. He went down the stairs faster than an ordinary owner should have. In the kitchen, amid the heat rising from the burners and the scent of simmering tomato sauce, the head chef was kneeling on one knee with Callie in his arms, her body limp against his broad chest like a broken branch. Her face was deathly pale, her lashes half closed, her lips moving around words that made no sound. Several employees crowded nearby, one pouring water, another fanning her with a menu, and the chef looked up at Enzo with the grave expression of a man who had witnessed something like this before in his life. Her blood sugar dropped, that's all. I caught her before she hit the floor. She's too light. Far too light for it not to be worrying. It was in the moment the chef lifted her to carry her toward the couch in the staff room that something slipped from the pocket of her apron and landed on the tile floor. A crumpled white envelope, its edges worn from being folded and opened many times. No one noticed it amid the confusion. No one except Enzo. He bent down and picked it up, intending to return it to her apron pocket. But the envelope wasn't sealed, and the paper inside had already slid partly free, exposing bold printed words that a man like him couldn't fail to recognize in a single glance. Debt demand notice. He straightened, turned his back to the group gathered around Callie, and pulled the paper out completely. He knew he was crossing a boundary, but some boundaries existed to be crossed when a young woman had just collapsed from hunger in the middle of his restaurant. The document carried no company name, no office address, no customer service number, only an amount and a deadline. And the amount made Enzo Caruso, a man who had signed checks worth 7 figures without blinking, fall completely still. This wasn't the kind of debt a waitress took on to cover her rent. It was the kind of number capable of crushing an entire life, the kind of number no one borrowed simply to survive, but could only be buried beneath. On an evening shift wage and tips, Callie could have worked until the end of her life without ever reaching the interest. His gaze moved to the bottom corner of the page and stopped on a detail so small that another person might have missed it. Faintly pressed into the paper, pale as a water stain, was the image of a raven with its wings spread wide. There were no words beside it, only a raven. Legitimate lenders didn't hide behind a watermark, and men who hid their faces never printed anything without a reason. That raven was a signature, a warning that this debt belonged to someone with a name in the shadows, and Enzo fixed it in his memory the way he would remember an enemy's face. Then he looked at the final line, where a reduced copy of the borrower's signature appeared. Callie Sutton. The handwriting was soft and rounded, leaning slightly to the right. At first glance, it looked exactly like the writing he saw every night on the order slips she filled out, scraps of paper he had occasionally picked up while checking the service station. But Enzo had spent his entire career reading the things other people overlooked, and the longer he studied it, the more he sensed that something was wrong. Callie's handwriting on her order slips belonged to someone writing in haste during a crowded shift, the pressure uneven, the final letters often swallowed. Certain strokes pressed harder where the paper rested against a tray. The signature on this debt notice, however, was perfectly even, patiently rounded, every line completed in full, as though the person signing hadn't been rushed, hadn't been trembling, hadn't been standing in the middle of any noisy kitchen of life. A person could imitate a signature with 90% accuracy, but no one could imitate the urgency of a real hand. He folded the paper along its old creases, returned the envelope to the apron hanging over the back of the chair, and said nothing to anyone. In the staff room, Callie was beginning to wake. Her eyelids fluttered open, and her hazel eyes needed several seconds to understand where she was. The first thing she said, in a voice that still hadn't recovered its strength, wasn't to ask what had happened to her, and it wasn't to call out the name of anyone she loved. She asked, "Did I ruin the dinner shift?" The entire room fell silent for a beat. The head chef had to turn away and pretend to wipe his hands on his apron. A young woman had collapsed from exhaustion, and her first thought upon waking was that she might have inconvenienced someone else. Enzo stood in the doorway listening to that question, and felt something move inside his chest in a way he hadn't permitted for many years. He turned to the chef and spoke briefly. "Make her a hot meal, a complete one, right now, and I'll sit with her to make sure she finishes it." 15 minutes later, in a quiet corner of the staff room, a tray of steaming food was placed on the table. A plate of pasta in cream sauce, hot soup, and freshly baked bread still fragrant with butter. Callie sat before the tray with both hands in her lap, watching Enzo with the wary expression of someone waiting to hear what condition came with it. He offered none. He simply pulled out a chair and sat across from her, poured her a glass of water, and said one word, "Eat." Then he remained silent. Not a single question about the envelope, about the name Wade, or about the black pickup truck. There was only the patient silence of a man who had learned that sometimes the kindest thing one person could give another wasn't a question, but a meal and a safe stretch of quiet. Callie picked up the fork, cautiously at first, taking small bites, her eyes still lifting every so often as though she feared being judged. But then real hunger restrained for far too long, took over. She began eating faster, finished every drop of soup, cleared the plate of pasta, and ate the final piece of bread, eating like someone who could no longer remember the last time she had sat before a hot meal prepared only for her. Enzo remained still as he watched her, showing no pity and asking no questions, quietly pushing the breadbasket closer whenever it began to empty. And in that moment, The final piece of the past several nights settled into place inside his mind. The containers of leftover food she asked for each evening in that hesitant voice. The final pieces of bread from the day. The soup left at the bottom of the pot that she claimed she was taking home for the neighbor's cat. There had never been a cat. There had only been a young woman living on the second floor above a laundromat, saving every dollar for a bottomless debt, and carrying that paper container against her chest through the cold streets each night, only to return to the restaurant the following morning with a polite smile and serve tables overflowing with food while no one knew she was hungry. 2 days after Callie fainted, a new notice appeared on the bulletin board in Il Faro's staff room, brief and unexplained, exactly in the style of the man whose name was signed beneath it. Beginning that week, every evening shift employee would share a family meal before the restaurant opened, prepared by the kitchen, with no deduction from wages and no exceptions. In old Italian restaurants, the family meal had once been a tradition, the entire staff sitting down together like a household before the storm of the evening descended. But that tradition had disappeared from Il Faro after Enzo's father died, when the restaurant became a machine that operated with flawless, cold precision. Now it had returned, sudden as rain in the middle of a dry season. The manager read the notice twice, then quietly went to rearrange the schedule. The head chef finished reading and gave a small nod to himself, as though something he had suspected since the night he held that weightless young woman in his arms had just been confirmed. No one said it aloud, but everyone in the restaurant understood whom this new rule had been created for. And what pleased Enzo was that not one person, from the youngest kitchen assistant to the longest-serving waiter, allowed Callie to sense it. They simply pulled her into a chair as though she were the youngest member of the family, so naturally that she didn't even have time to refuse. On Friday afternoon, the long table near the kitchen door was covered with a cloth, and for the first time in years, the first floor of Il Faro, filled with a sound that didn't belong to customers, the laughter of the people who made the place what it was. The head chef carried out large platters of pasta, herb-roasted chicken, salad dressed with olive oil, and a tray of garlic bread that he proudly declared came from a recipe he had never prepared for any paying guest. Enzo didn't sit at the head of the table. He chose a seat among everyone else, beside the manager and diagonally across from Callie, close enough to observe her but far enough away that she wouldn't feel pressured. During the first few days, she ate cautiously, always waiting until everyone else had served themselves, always choosing the smallest portion. But by the third meal, something inside her began to thaw, slowly, like the first snow of the season beneath sunlight. She began to join the conversation, at first with only a brief answer when someone asked her a question, then gradually with small stories of her own. And it was during one such afternoon meal, when the young kitchen assistant complained about an oil burn on his wrist, that Callie did something she hadn't done during all 14 months she had worked at Il Faro. She spoke about herself without being asked. She told the young man to let her see his wrist, gently turning it beneath the light with a confidence that surprised the entire table, then said the burn needed to be kept dry, and that he shouldn't put toothpaste on it the way the kitchen staff always told one another to do, because her mother would have scolded anyone for half an hour if she ever caught them putting toothpaste on a burn. Someone asked whether her mother had worked in medicine. Callie paused for half a second, like someone who had accidentally opened a door that had always remained locked, but then she didn't close it again. She said, softly but clearly, that her mother had been a nurse and had spent nearly her entire life working in the internal medicine department of a large hospital, and that her mother's hands had bandaged more strangers than they had cooked meals for herself. The table grew quiet as everyone listened, and Callie, sheltered within that gentle silence, continued with one small memory. She told them that when she was still in school, there had been a night when she and her mother had only enough money left for one dinner. Yet on the way home, her mother had still stopped to buy warm bread for an elderly homeless man sitting outside a church. When Callie had sulked and asked why, her mother had simply stroked her hair and spoken the words Callie had carried with her for the rest of her life. A person can be poor in money, sweetheart, but never allow yourself to become poor in heart. The head chef nodded solemnly and said the woman had been absolutely right, then began telling the story of how he had once burned an entire pot of sauce on the busiest night of the year and had practically fallen to his knees before the former owner to beg forgiveness. His clumsy and exaggerated reenactment made the whole table burst into laughter. And in the middle of that laughter, Enzo heard it. Callie's laugh. It wasn't the polite social laugh she used with customers, but a sound that escaped before she could restrain it, clear and slightly awkward, like something that hadn't been used in a very long time. It lasted only a few seconds, But during those few seconds, her entire face changed. Her hazel eyes brightened, her cheeks warmed beneath the golden light, and the exhaustion that always seemed carved into her features disappeared, revealing the face of a 27-year-old woman who should have looked that way all the time if life had been only a little kinder to her. Enzo caught himself watching her longer than an employer should watch one of his employees, and he didn't look away. Then the phone inside her apron pocket began to vibrate, and the light that had just appeared on her face vanished like a candle in the wind. The laughter around the table continued. No one noticed her hand quietly pressing against the fabric to silence the vibration, and no one noticed her shoulders stiffening beneath her uniform. No one except the man sitting diagonally across from her. Their eyes met across the table, and Enzo asked in a voice low enough for only her to hear, "Is everything all right?" Callie looked at him, pulled her familiar, polite smile back into place like someone hastily putting on an old coat, and answered, "It's nothing important, sir." He nodded, didn't ask anything else, quietly refilled her glass of water, and turned back to hear the rest of the chef's story. He didn't push her, because he understood something that 10 years of power had taught him. Trust wasn't something that could be demanded, it could only be waited for. People didn't open their doors to someone pounding outside. They opened them for the person who had stood there patiently with empty hands. But refusing to pressure her didn't mean doing nothing. That night, when Callie left the restaurant through the back entrance with her purse held close, as she had made a habit of doing during the past several weeks, a gray car quietly pulled away from a parking space half a block away. Behind the wheel sat one of Gideon's most discreet security men, carrying instructions that contained only 3 points. Keep your distance, don't let her know you're there, and don't leave until she is safely behind her door. The gray car followed the bus, through streets washed with scattered light, stopped at the top of a small hill on the west side of the city, and remained in the darkness as the slight young woman walked the final distance, past the laundromat after it had closed, and climbed the narrow staircase along the side of the building. Only when the second-floor window came alive with a weak yellow glow did the gray car start its engine and drive away. From that night forward, as steadily as breathing, there was always a car like that waiting in the darkness behind Callie Sutton, and she had no idea that on the streets she had traveled alone for the past 2 years. For the first time, she was no longer alone. On Tuesday afternoon of the following week, when the autumn sunlight had turned the color of honey across the rooftops of River North, a knock sounded outside the second-floor office. 3 soft, widely spaced taps, the kind made by someone who had spent a long time in the hallway trying to persuade herself to knock at all. Enzo was seated behind his desk, and even before the door opened, he knew who was standing on the other side, because there was only one person in the entire restaurant who knocked as though apologizing for the sound of her own hand. Callie stepped inside, still wearing her evening shift uniform, her hair neat. It wasn't the constant weariness he had grown accustomed to seeing, nor was it the fear that tightened across her face whenever her phone vibrated. It was the strange calm of someone who had made a decision, the kind of calm Enzo had seen on the faces of people preparing to do the thing that would hurt them most. She crossed the room with measured steps, stopped before his desk, and placed a white envelope on the polished wood with both hands, carefully and solemnly, as though she were offering something sacred or surrendering something sacred. "I'm submitting my resignation," she said, her voice rehearsed so carefully that it wouldn't tremble, effective as soon as you accept it. Enzo looked at the envelope, then at her, and for one brief moment, he heard the echo of a long-forgotten afternoon inside his mind, when he had still been a boy standing behind the bar, listening to his father say that people left a place for only 2 reasons. Either the place was no longer worthy of them, or they had come to believe they were no longer worthy of the place. He opened the envelope and removed the single sheet inside. The resignation had been written by hand in the soft, rounded script he already knew, though the hurried strokes he recognized from her order slips had been shaped slowly and carefully now, as though she had written it during the night, then written it again and again. It was brief. There was a message of gratitude to the restaurant, to her co-workers, and to the family meals she described as the most beautiful afternoons she had known in the past 2 years, followed by an apology that offered no explanation. Enzo read it once from beginning to end. Then he read it a second time, more slowly. Not because he needed to understand what she had written, but because he was searching between the lines for what she had left unsaid. The room was so quiet that he could hear the soft crackling of the fireplace and the distant murmur of the city beyond the glass. At last, he looked up and asked in a calm, gentle voice, "May I know why?" Callie had prepared herself for that question. He could see it in the breath she drew before answering. "Staying here isn't fair to the restaurant anymore," she said. "You and everyone else have been too kind to me, kinder than I deserve, and that's exactly why I have to leave." She paused, lowering her eyes to the desk, then spoke the words Enzo knew were the most honest she had ever given him. "There's a storm following my life, and my storm shouldn't touch anyone else. It shouldn't touch this place." Enzo remained still. 10 years at the head of an empire had taught him to recognize the moment when someone was sacrificing herself, and what made his chest feel heavy wasn't the resignation letter, but the fact that this young woman believed the only way to protect people who had shown her kindness was to disappear from their lives. He lifted the letter, folded it along its original crease, placed it back inside the envelope, and with a slow, decisive movement, pushed it across the desk toward her. "I'm not accepting this today," he said. Callie stared at the envelope as though it were something impossible. "You can't do that," she said, her voice wavering for the first time. "I just did," Enzo replied. "If there's a problem with your work, then we'll discuss your work. But you and I both know there isn't a single word in this letter that has anything to do with your work." She shook her head, and the calm she had carried into the room began to crack. "You don't understand," she said, both hands tightening together in front of her. "There are things that don't let go once they attach themselves to you. They follow you wherever you go, and the people standing closest are the first ones they reach. I've seen it happen before. I can't let it happen here. Not to the people who gave me a seat at their table and treated me like family." Her voice broke on the final word. Enzo rose, walked around the desk, but stopped several steps away, far enough that she wouldn't feel cornered, and spoke in a voice he had never used with any business partner or enemy, a voice that carried no authority at all. "Then help me understand." Only 4 words. No command, no promise, no attempt to soothe her. 4 words placed between them like an outstretched hand. Callie lifted her eyes to him, and in those hazel depths, Enzo saw a violent struggle taking place. He saw words rising all the way to her throat, saw the longing of someone who had carried a burden for far too long and desperately wanted to set it down. Her lips parted. For 1 second, he believed she was going to speak, but then something inside her, something fear had trained over the course of 2 years, dragged every word back into silence. She lowered her gaze, stepped away, and whispered, "I'm sorry for wasting your time." She turned toward the door, moving faster than when she had entered, like someone fleeing the very moment in which she had nearly allowed herself to become vulnerable. Her hand closed around the handle and turned it halfway, then stopped. 1 second. For only 1 second, her hand remained motionless against the brass, her shoulders shifting slightly as though she might turn back, while Enzo stood in the center of the room, silent and waiting. But the door opened. She stepped through it, and the sound of her footsteps faded down the stairs. The white envelope remained on the desk, unaccepted. Enzo stared at it for a long time in the dying afternoon light, then placed it inside the locked drawer beside the brown file, 2 secrets belonging to the same person resting side by side in the darkness. At that moment, the phone on his desk lit up with a message from Gideon, brief and stripped of every unnecessary word. Like all his reports, the pickup returned 20 minutes ago. Same position, but tonight it didn't come alone. There's a second vehicle parked 1 block away. Dark windows. License plate can't be traced. We haven't identified which side it belongs to. Enzo stood beside the window and looked down at the street as its lights came alive, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, unfamiliar eyes were fixed upon the building that carried the Caruso name. 1 vehicle was surveillance, 2 vehicles were a formation, and the instinct sharpened by 10 years in the shadows of this city told him that a new player had just taken a place at the board, one whose face he had yet to see. Gideon returned to the second-floor office on a gray morning at the beginning of the week, carrying a second brown envelope, thicker than the first, and wearing a contemplative expression rarely seen on a face that almost never revealed anything. He placed the envelope on the desk, poured himself a cup of coffee without waiting to be invited, sat in the chair opposite Enzo, and spoke in the voice of a man about to tell a story that disturbed even him. "I found the answer to your question, the question of why that young woman never went to the police. And I should warn you now, the answer won't make you feel any better." Enzo closed the notebook lying open before him, leaned back in his chair, and waited. Gideon opened the envelope and removed the first sheet of paper. "She did report it once," he said. "Only once, about 8 months ago, at a police station on the west side of the city, near where she lives." My people found the intake record. She arrived in the morning and stated that a man she had once known kept calling her, sending messages, and appearing at the places where she worked and traveled, making her fear for her safety. She sat at the station for nearly 3 hours. In the end, they sent her home with a conclusion recorded in a single brief line: insufficient evidence of threatening conduct. Gideon placed the paper on the desk, and his voice slowed. From what my people were able to learn, the officer who took her statement asked the usual questions. Had he ever hit her? Had he ever clearly threatened to kill her? Were there any witnesses? Were there any messages containing a direct threat? Her answer to every question was no, because that man was smarter than that. He never wrote a threat in black and white. He only called. He only waited. He only appeared. He only smiled from across the street. Those things can keep a woman awake every night, but in the eyes of the law, they aren't yet considered anything at all. They told her to come back when something happened. Enzo remained silent for a long time. He thought about the way Callie turned her phone face down on the tray instead of blocking the number, the way she left through the back door instead of asking someone to walk her home, the way she cried in the dark kitchen instead of calling anyone. She had tried to do the right thing. She had knocked on the very door society taught people to knock on, and that door had closed in her face with one polite sentence: "Come back when something happens." People didn't understand that for someone like Callie, something happened every day. It simply happened where no camera could record it, inside her chest. But that was only the first side of the vice, Gideon continued, pulling out the second sheet. The second side is what truly sealed her mouth shut. My people recovered part of an old message from a backed-up data source, within the limits you authorized. Read only, no contact with anyone. Wade Mercer sent her a message several months ago, immediately after she went to the police station, as though he knew she had gone. Gideon put on his glasses and read the message word for word in an even voice that made its meaning sound colder still. Go ahead and try telling someone about the loan. The signature on that paper looks so much like yours that even you would think you signed it. Who do you think they'll believe? Some little waitress claiming she knows nothing, or a signed document with your name, your social security number, and your signature. Tell them, and you'll become a debtor running from what she owes, and a liar too. Gideon removed his glasses and folded the arms together. The room fell silent, leaving only the soft crackling of the fire and the first drops of rain beginning to tap against the window. Now the picture is complete, he said quietly. The law told her she didn't have enough evidence to be protected, and that man told her the evidence itself would be used against her. One side was a closed door, the other was an open trap. Anyone caught between those two jaws would learn the same lesson, that silence was the only safe place left. Enzo rose and walked toward the window. Below, his father's restaurant was preparing for another day, and somewhere on the first floor, a young woman was folding napkins with a polite smile, carrying a crumpled envelope in her apron pocket and 2 invisible jaws around her chest. He understood now why the resignation letter had been written with such care. She wasn't running away from the restaurant. She was trying to draw the storm away from the last people who had shown her kindness, using the only method someone who no longer trusted any door could imagine. Enzo turned back toward the desk, and when he spoke, his voice had returned to the one Gideon knew best, the voice he used when making decisions. 2 things, he said. First, I need a complete copy of that loan document, obtained quietly and without leaving a trace, then delivered directly to the family's handwriting expert, the best one, the man who worked for the courts before he worked for us. I want a scientific conclusion strong enough to stand anywhere, determining whether that signature belongs to Callie Sutton. I've seen the handwriting, Gideon. It looks like hers, but it's forged. The person who signed that paper wrote far too evenly for someone filling out orders in the middle of a crowded shift. I need science to say what my eyes have already seen. Gideon nodded, committing the instruction to memory without needing a notebook. Second, Enzo continued, opening the locked drawer and placing the first brown file on the desk. He turned to the page containing the number that had left him speechless the week before. Find the organization behind this debt and buy the entire thing. Principal and interest. No negotiation. Cash if necessary. I want that document to change hands before the end of the week. Gideon studied his employer for a moment, then asked the question his position required him to ask. You understand that buying a debt from the shadows means placing one foot inside the seller's darkness. There are faster ways for a name like Caruso to make a man like Wade Mercer disappear from that young woman's life. Enzo closed the file. My father had one saying he repeated more often than any other, he said. A man who uses his fists on a problem that can be solved with his mind is a lazy man. I don't intend to be lazy about this. Once the debt is in my hands, that man loses the rope he has tied around her. And no one has to bleed, no one has to go to prison, and no stain reaches this roof. That's how my father would have done it. Gideon stood, fastened his coat, and for the first time that morning, something close to a smile passed across the old soldier's face. He would be proud, Gideon said simply. Then he picked up his leather case and stepped into the rain, which was falling harder now, carrying his orders and enough cash to purchase an entire nightmare. Enzo remained alone in the office, watching the rain stream down the glass, and for the first time since the night he heard Callie crying in the kitchen, he allowed himself to believe it was almost over, simple and clean, like a chess game in which he could already see checkmate. He didn't yet know that on the other side of the board, another hand had moved 3 weeks before his. Gideon returned on Thursday evening, 2 days later than expected, and the moment he stepped through the door of the second-floor office, Enzo knew something was wrong. It wasn't because the leather case still held the full weight of the unspent cash, nor was it because the old soldier's shoulders sagged beneath his rain-soaked coat. It was his face. In the 10 years since Enzo had taken control of the empire from his dying father, he had seen Gideon's face under every circumstance. During negotiations that left no room to breathe, during nights when the entire family stood at the edge of ruin, and not once, not a single time, had the older man worn the expression he wore tonight. It was the face of someone who had seen something he wished he hadn't seen. Gideon didn't sit down. He stood in the middle of the room, placed the untouched leather case on a chair, and spoke without preamble, because he knew his employer didn't need to be prepared. I couldn't buy the debt. Enzo frowned slightly. They wanted a higher price. No, Gideon said, shaking his head. No one named a price. No one is selling because there's nothing left to sell. Callie Sutton's debt changed hands 3 weeks ago. He paused for a moment, as though he needed to draw breath before placing the name on the table. It's in Harlan Voss's hands. The room seemed to grow several degrees colder. Enzo said nothing for a long while. That name required no explanation. Not for him. Not for anyone who had lived long enough beneath the visible surface of this city. Harlan Voss, the man behind the largest underground lending network on the south side of Chicago, a man now in his 50s who had never once stood before a judge, a man who had spent nearly a decade patiently gnawing away at the edges of Caruso territory, the way seawater eroded the base of a levee, never loudly enough to become a war, never quietly enough to be called peace. Tell me, Enzo said, his voice dropping lower. Everything. Gideon removed a thin bundle of papers from the inside pocket of his coat, but he didn't need to look at them. Every detail had been carved into his mind during the entire journey back. My people followed the loan network, he began, from the collectors at the bottom to the man holding the paper. And the higher they went, the more every road converged on the same point. Do you remember the raven watermark on the debt notice? Enzo nodded. He remembered. He had fixed it in his mind like an enemy's face from the night in the staff room. It belongs to Voss, Gideon said. Not to one of his collectors and not to some intermediary office. The raven is the private mark of the network he built with his own hands. That means the loan, from the very first document, from the first day Callie Sutton's name was written on it, had already been flowing through Voss's veins. Wade Mercer didn't borrow money from some nameless operation and then attach her name to it. He borrowed directly from the Raven's system, and that system accepted a substitute name from the beginning. A young woman with no parents, no relatives, no one standing behind her, the perfect kind of prey they had always hunted. Enzo sat motionless, as each layer of truth settled into his mind, like cards being turned face up. The crumpled envelope in her apron pocket, the amount large enough to crush an entire life, the signature that had been written with too steady a hand, all of it carried the same scent, the scent of the raven, long before he had even known it existed. But there's still something I don't understand, he said slowly. If the debt had belonged to Voss's system from the beginning, what changed 3 weeks ago? Why did you say it changed hands? Gideon looked at his employer, and this was the part he had paced through the rain trying to find a way to explain. Because 3 weeks ago, the debt was removed from the collector's ledger and transferred directly into Voss's own hands, he said. He is holding it personally. Do you understand what that means? Inside the Raven's network, Thousands of debts are scattered through the lower levels, and the man at the top would never concern himself with one minor loan belonging to a waitress, unless that loan had suddenly become worth more than money. 3 weeks ago, sir, was the same period when the pickup truck began parking outside Il Faro for 6 consecutive nights. 3 weeks ago was also when, according to what my people heard through the cracks in the underworld, a rumor began spreading that Enzo Caruso, the man no one had been able to find a weakness in for 10 years, had taken an interest in a timid waitress at his father's restaurant. Voss caught the scent, and he did what a raven always does when it sees something shining. He picked it up. He pulled the debt into his own hands because he understood that he wasn't holding a promissory note. He was holding a chess piece, aimed directly at you. Enzo rose and walked toward the window, while Gideon continued behind him, his voice as steady and merciless as the truth. Now every move he has made is clear. Have you wondered why that pickup only sat there and did nothing night after night? Because Voss wasn't allowed to do anything. To strike someone beneath the Caruso roof would be an open declaration of war, and declaring open war on this family is something he still isn't strong enough to do. He knows that, so he chose the way of the raven. He doesn't attack, he only waits. He needed one of 2 things to happen. Either the young woman would break first, quit willingly, leave the city willingly, step beyond the protection of the Caruso name on her own, allowing him to collect his peace without spending a single arrow. Or you would break first, lose your temper, send someone to deal with Mercer, and strike openly before the entire city, giving Voss proof that the Caruso family had attacked an ordinary civilian over a woman, the perfect excuse to draw the other families to his side. That pickup wasn't parked there to frighten Callie Sutton, sir. It was parked there to bait Enzo Caruso. And Wade Mercer? Enzo asked without turning around, his eyes still fixed on the street below. A pawn, Gideon replied. He owed the Raven system so much that there was no way out, and Voss purchased him with that debt, erasing part of it in exchange for every week he stood waiting, every call he made, every appearance at exactly the right place and time. The deranged admirer we thought we were watching was nothing more than a puppet being paid to play the role of a deranged admirer. The room fell silent. Enzo stood before the large window, looking down at the familiar place across the street, empty tonight, and that emptiness suddenly took on the shape of a message. He had believed he was the observer. For weeks, he had sat on the second floor looking down, remembering every detail, every phone turned face down, every faltering step, believing he was quietly unraveling a secret. But throughout those same weeks, another pair of eyes, older, colder, and more patient, had been sitting somewhere in the city's darkness watching him, remembering every family meal he introduced, every security car he sent out, every sign that the heart of the Caruso heir had begun to beat out of rhythm because of a young woman. This game had begun before he even knew he was playing, and the first piece placed on the board hadn't been a vehicle or a debt notice, but a timid young woman carrying a container of leftover food through the cold streets, a woman who still didn't know that the misery of her life had been picked up by an old raven, sharpened, and aimed directly at the only man who had ever given her a hot meal. On Saturday night, rain began pouring over Chicago at dusk and showed no sign of stopping. Il Faro closed later than usual because of a large dinner party, and by the time the final guest departed, the clock had already moved past midnight. Enzo was still in the second-floor office, but not because of work. Since the night Gideon had brought the name Harlan Voss into that room and placed it on the table, Enzo had stopped leaving the restaurant before Callie went home. He told no one. He simply remained there each night in silence, as though it were a new habit, or perhaps a premonition. And tonight, that premonition spoke. Downstairs, Callie was finishing the final task of her shift, gathering the kitchen's bags of garbage and carrying them to the disposal container in the small parking area behind the restaurant, where a narrow alley opened onto the main street. She pushed through the rear door and stepped into the rain with a garbage bag in her hand, never seeing the figure concealed behind the container until it was too late. Wade Mercer stepped out and blocked the space between her and the door. He wore a dark coat soaked completely through, proof that he had been waiting in the rain for a long time, but the smile on his face remained as dry and sweet as ever, the kind of smile that had persuaded so many people to believe he was a pleasant man. "Hello, sweetheart," he said, his voice gentle as though soothing a child. "You're difficult to see these days. I call you over and over, but you never answer. I wait for you night after night, but you always leave through the back. And now it turns out the back door is where we finally meet. Don't you think that's funny?" Callie stepped backward instinctively, the garbage bag slipping from her hand as her back struck the freezing edge of the container. "Please go home, Wade," she said, struggling to keep her voice steady. "We don't have anything left to say to each other." "Nothing left to say," he repeated, and the smile on his lips didn't move an inch. "That's exactly the problem, sweetheart. You keep making decisions for both of us." He took one step toward her, and when Callie turned, trying to slip around him and run back inside, his hand shot out and closed tightly around her wrist, holding her in place. He didn't squeeze hard enough to hurt her. No, Wade Mercer had never been that clumsy. His grip was only firm enough to make her understand that she wasn't going anywhere, only firm enough to blur the boundary between pleading and threatening beneath the rain. "I only want to talk," he said, leaning closer while his voice remained sickeningly sweet. 10 minutes, that's all. You owe me that. After everything we once had, you owe me 10 minutes. Callie tried to pull her hand free once, then twice, but his fingers remained locked around her wrist like a handcuff wrapped in velvet. Rain streamed down her face and mingled with something saltier than rainwater. And in that desperate moment, she heard a voice come from the direction of the rear door, so calm that it might have been discussing the weather. Wade Mercer, only 2 words, his full name, spoken slowly and clearly through the sound of the rain. Wade's body stiffened. He turned his head, and beneath the single yellow light over the parking area, he saw Enzo Caruso standing there alone, without guards, without a weapon, not even bothering to shelter himself from the rain, both hands resting loosely at his sides, in the manner of a man who had never needed to hurry. Enzo descended the 3 steps, one at a time, the rain darkening the shoulders of his shirt, and as he walked, he spoke in a voice no louder than the rainfall, yet every word came through with unsettling clarity. Wade Mercer, 33 years old, unemployed for the past 14 months. Then he recited a number, slowly, completely, and accurate to the final dollar. The amount known by only 3 people in the world, the man who owed it, the man who held it, and now the man walking toward them through the rain. "That's how much you owe the people you know perfectly well never forget," Enzo said. "Did I read it correctly? Or would you like me to give you the date of the original loan as well?" The color drained from Wade's face. His sweet smile, the weapon that had never betrayed him, cracked for the first time like paint exposed to water. A man who could recite that number was a man whose reach extended into the deepest places of the city's darkness. And Wade understood that more quickly than any threat could have made him understand. Enzo stopped 3 steps away from them, lowered his gaze to the hand gripping Callie's wrist, then raised his eyes to meet Wade's, and spoke one sentence, each word falling with the same heavy rhythm as the rain striking the metal lid of the container. "You know what the Caruso name means in this city. Let her go, and don't make me say it twice." There was no shouting, no fist was raised. There was no movement except the falling rain. There was only silence. The dense silence Enzo Caruso had learned to wield more skillfully than any weapon, settling over the small parking area and completing the rest of the work. Within that silence, everything could be heard, the rain drumming against the metal roof, the water running through the gutters, and the reason inside a gambler's mind, calculating very quickly whether 10 minutes of conversation was worth the remainder of his life. Wade's fingers slowly loosened, then released her completely. He retreated 1 step, then another, gradually disappearing into the rain and the darkness of the alley. But just as his body was about to dissolve into the night, he stopped, and as though unable to contain one final drop of poison, he called back, his voice stripped of every trace of sweetness, leaving only the bitterness of a chess piece that knew it was about to be swept from the board. "She isn't worth the trouble, Mr. Caruso. Someone is paying far more to make her disappear." Then he turned away, and the rain swallowed him whole. The words remained suspended in the air like the smoke left behind by a gunshot. Enzo stood motionless for 1 beat, fixing every word in his memory and placing it beside the name Harlan Voss inside his mind. 2 pieces of the puzzle fitting together on their own before the rain, their only witness. Then he turned toward Callie. She was still pressed against the container, her entire body trembling in waves. Whether from the cold or from what had just walked away, he couldn't tell. Her right hand rose to her chest, her rain-soaked fingers finding the silver necklace and closing tightly around its pendant as they had done for the past 2 years, as though it were the final source of support left to her in the world. Her lips moved, and through the sound of the rain, Enzo heard the 3 words she had concealed behind a polite smile for 14 months. The 3 words she had never allowed herself to say to anyone. "I'm so afraid. Not "I'm fine," not "I'm sorry." For the first time, that naked and trembling truth was spoken aloud, and it weighed more than any confession Enzo had ever heard in his life. He didn't tell her everything would be all right, because he didn't promise what he couldn't yet guarantee. He only removed his coat, already wet across the shoulders, and gently placed it around her trembling body, carefully keeping enough distance that she wouldn't feel trapped for even one more second. Then he spoke softly, in the voice a person reserved for something precious. "I know. And beginning tonight, you won't have to be afraid alone anymore." That night, Enzo didn't call for a security car. He opened the door of his black sedan for Callie himself, and she, still wrapped in his coat that was far too large for her, settled into the passenger seat without enough strength left to offer the polite refusal she usually gave. Neither of them spoke during the drive toward the west side of the city. Rain continued to fall against the windshield, the lights of the streets smearing into long streaks before slipping past, and Enzo drove more slowly than necessary, not because the roads were slick, but because he understood that some silences needed to be allowed to last, that some silences could do the work of comfort better than words. From time to time, out of the corner of his eye, he saw her staring through the window, her fingers still gripping the edges of his coat around her shoulders, and he noticed that the trembling in those shoulders was gradually growing less frequent with every block they passed, like the fading echo of a storm moving farther away. When the car stopped in front of the darkened laundromat, Callie remained seated for a while longer, then turned toward him as though she meant to say something. But Enzo only shook his head gently. "Go upstairs and rest," he said. "Everything else can wait until tomorrow." She nodded, opened the car door, and took small steps through the rain toward the narrow staircase along the side of the building. Enzo didn't start the engine. He sat in the darkness of the car with both hands resting on the steering wheel, watching until her figure disappeared around the turn of the stairs, then continued waiting with the same patience he had shown throughout the past several weeks, until the small window on the second floor came alive with its familiar weak yellow light. Only then did he drive away, and during the entire journey back, Wade Mercer's words repeated inside his mind like a recording. "Someone is paying far more to make her disappear." Each repetition carved more deeply into his thoughts the name he knew stood behind everything. The following morning, when Callie opened her staff locker before beginning her shift, she found a white envelope resting neatly on the top shelf. There was no money inside it, and no letter, only a solid black key card bearing the Il Faro logo, the kind of card she knew was issued only to managers, granting access to the rear entrance where a security employee was always stationed from afternoon until late at night, and a small piece of paper folded in half. She opened the note. There was only one handwritten line, the script straight, precise, and restrained, just like the man who had written it. No one should have to begin or end a day in fear. There was no signature. None was needed. Callie stood before the locker for a long time, reading the sentence for the third time, and the coworkers passing behind her saw only that she quickly lowered her eyes and pressed the note against her chest for a single moment, before folding it again and placing it in the deepest compartment of her purse, the place where people kept things they intended to hold on to far longer than the life of an apron. From that day forward, Il Faro changed in a way only those inside it could feel, and no outsider could name. No notice appeared on the bulletin board. No meeting was called. It was simply that the security employee, who usually sat inside the guard station, now happened to stand beneath the rear awning, smoking at precisely the hour when the garbage was taken out, with a coincidence so natural that no one questioned it. It was simply that Callie's schedule was rearranged that week, her latest closing shifts quietly transferred to other employees, while the manager casually explained that he was trying to balance the hours more fairly across the whole team. It was simply that every night when she left the restaurant, one of Il Faro's cars always happened to be passing through the west side, and the driver always said the same thing: "I'm going that way anyway. Get in and save yourself the bus fare." Not one of those people mentioned the rainy night in the parking lot. Not one of them asked her a single question. And that gentle silence, the kind that didn't demand that she tell the story, didn't require her to explain herself, and didn't turn her into a subject of discussion, accomplished what nothing else had managed to do in 2 years. It allowed Callie Sutton to feel like an ordinary person again. On Wednesday afternoon, she knocked on the door of the second-floor office. There were still 3 soft taps, but Enzo immediately noticed something different. They were no longer separated by hesitant pauses as they had been before. She entered without carrying an envelope, her hands no longer clasped tightly in front of her, and she said, I came to thank you. For the card. For the car every night. And for all the things you think I haven't noticed." Enzo was about to say that they were only the bare minimum, but he stopped himself in time, because he saw something that made every word unnecessary. Callie was looking directly into his eyes as she thanked him. Her head wasn't lowered. For 14 months, he had grown accustomed to seeing the young woman offer her gratitude with her head bowed, as though her thankfulness always had to be accompanied by submission, as though she believed she had no right to stand upright when kindness was given to her. But that afternoon, for the first time, her thanks came from a woman standing with her back straight, and Enzo realized that this was what he had wanted to see more than anything else, more than her smile, even more than the sound of her laughter during that family meal. "I only did what a roof is supposed to do," he answered simply. She smiled, a small smile but one without strain, then asked permission to return to her shift. The door closed behind her, and the smile on Enzo's face slowly disappeared as well, giving way to the vigilance that had become part of his blood after 10 years at the head of the family. Because within the peaceful picture taking shape before him, there was one detail that was wrong, so wrong that it chilled him. 4 days had passed since the rainy night, and Wade Mercer had vanished completely. Not a single call had reached Callie's phone, and Gideon's people had confirmed it. The pickup truck hadn't appeared again, and the vehicle with dark windows had also disappeared from every street surrounding Il Faro. To anyone else, it would have looked like victory. To Enzo, it was the most frightening sign of all. He had lived long enough to know that men like Harlan Voss never withdrew their forces. They only changed their move. This silence wasn't peace. It was the pause of a hand lifting another piece from the board, and Enzo still couldn't see which piece it was. He sent Gideon a single line: "Double the watch. He's about to make his next move." But there was one move neither Enzo nor Gideon saw, because it didn't take place on any street. It happened in complete silence that very evening, on the screen of the phone inside Callie Sutton's purse, while she sat in the restaurant car taking her home. A message arrived from the name she had believed would remain silent forever. Wade. Only one message, with no call accompanying it and no second message following. Unusually brief for a man whose persistence had always seemed endless. And on the final line of that message was an address on the south side of the city where Callie had never been. She read it beneath the passing yellow glow of the streetlights, then read it again and again, and through the rearview mirror, the driver saw only that the young woman in the back seat suddenly sat upright, unnaturally still, while her right hand slowly rose to close around the silver pendant at her throat. That night, the weak yellow light in the window above the laundromat remained on until very late. On Thursday afternoon, Callie didn't arrive for her shift. At first, no one was worried. They thought she might be ill. The young woman had grown visibly thinner over the past several months, and the manager called her phone to check on her. The number couldn't be reached. He called a second time, then a third, but each time there was only the emotionless voice of the automated operator. By 6 o'clock, when the family meal was served and her familiar chair remained empty, the manager went upstairs and knocked on the office door. Enzo was seated before a stack of contracts, and one look at the man's face was enough to make him set down his pen. Callie hadn't come in. Her phone had been turned off since noon. During the next 10 minutes, the longest-serving employees at Il Faro witnessed something they would speak about for years afterward. For the first time, they saw Enzo Caruso lose his composure. He didn't shout. That man had never shouted, but they watched him stride down the stairs so quickly that one arm of his coat still hung loose, saw him make 3 calls in immediate succession, his voice growing more urgent with each one, and saw the calmest man in the city grip the edge of the bar until his knuckles turned white when the person on the other end reported that the car assigned to pick her up had arrived outside the laundromat early that afternoon, and the second-floor window had never lit up. Gideon arrived 15 minutes later with 2 of his most discreet men, and the machine the Caruso family had operated in silence for 10 years began turning at full force. Some went to the laundromat, others reviewed footage from every bus stop camera. Still others searched every hidden channel in the southern underworld. Gideon himself remained in the second-floor office, fitting each piece of the truth together with the cold discipline of an old soldier who understood that panic was a luxury no one could afford at a moment like this. In less than an hour, the full picture emerged, and it cast the room into its heaviest silence since the day Enzo's father died. The night before, after closing, Callie had been asked to carry a supplier file upstairs to the second-floor office. At that exact time, Enzo had been speaking with Gideon on the phone. The office door left partly open, and during that conversation, the two men had discussed things no Wall should ever have heard, that Callie's debt was now in Harlan Voss's hands, that the Raven was using her as a piece aimed directly at the Caruso family, and that the recent silence was merely the pause before his next move against Il Faro. Gideon's men found the supplier file resting neatly on the small table in the hallway. She had never knocked and delivered it by hand. She stood outside that partly open door long enough, Gideon said slowly, long enough to understand that the misery of her life had become the excuse for a war aimed at the only place that had ever shown her kindness. The final piece lay in the copied data report his men had just sent over. The message Wade had sent Callie 3 nights earlier. The only message, unusually brief, now displayed in full on the screen before Enzo. I won't bother you anymore. But if you want all of this to end, truly end, for you and for the people you're trying to protect, then come meet this man. He is the one who decides everything. Beneath those words was an address on the south side of the city. Enzo stood motionless before the screen, and inside his mind, everything fell into place with merciless precision. Voss had changed his move exactly as Enzo had expected, but the move hadn't been aimed at the restaurant or at him. It had been aimed at the young woman's heart, at the instinct buried so deeply inside Callie Sutton that both Voss and Enzo had recognized it. The instinct of someone who would rather carry the entire storm alone than allow it to touch anyone else. He didn't need to abduct her. He only needed to open a door and know with certainty that she would walk through it herself. The resignation letter from the week before returned to Enzo's mind. My storm shouldn't touch anyone else. And with a certainty cold enough to stop his breath, he understood that at that very moment, somewhere on the south side of the city, Callie was sitting across from Harlan Voss, prepared to sign a document accepting the full burden of a debt that had never belonged to her, prepared to promise that she would leave Chicago forever, exchanging everything that remained of her life for one assurance that the Raven would spare Il Faro and spare the people who had given her a place at their table and treated her like family. She thinks she's saving us, Gideon said quietly, and there was something in the old soldier's voice that came close to breaking. At that exact moment, his phone vibrated. He answered, and Enzo saw the change in his eyes. The examination results are in, Gideon said, still holding the phone. The expert concluded with the highest degree of certainty that the signature on the loan document doesn't belong to Callie Sutton. The strokes were traced slowly, the pressure unnaturally even. It was produced by a copying hand. But there's something else, and he raised his eyes to Enzo. This is the real blade. The blank paper used for that loan document, the paper type, its weight, even the Raven watermark, matches perfectly with the printing operation Voss's network uses for its own internal documents. That means the debt paper wasn't signed at some lending office and later acquired by Voss. It was created inside the Raven's own system, false from the moment it was born. A debt manufactured rather than borrowed. Enzo took the examination file from Gideon's hands, and for one moment, everyone in the room saw something ignite inside his gray eyes. Not anger, because they had seen his anger before, but the cold gleam of a sword being drawn from its sheath after 10 years. Prepare the car, he said. I'm driving myself. Gideon followed him. You can't enter the Raven's Nest alone. But Enzo had already reached the bottom of the stairs. Have your men follow at a distance, he said without turning around. But no one goes in before I do. He wants me angry. He wants me to make a mistake. He won't get that. He'll get something else. Then he rushed into the rain pouring over Chicago. The examination file pressed beneath his arm like a sword wrapped in paper, and the black sedan left the parking area so quickly that it carved 2 long trails of water across the road. The city streamed past the windows in blurred bands of wet light, and Enzo Caruso, the man who had sat through every life and death negotiation of the past 10 years without his pulse ever changing, heard his heart pounding in his throat for the first time. He knew what it meant to protect an empire. He knew what it meant to carry a family name upon his shoulders. But it wasn't until that night, driving through the rain toward the south side of the city, that he learned what it meant to fear losing a single human being, and he pressed the accelerator harder, because at the end of that road, inside the office of an old Raven, a young woman was lifting a pen, believing that her signature tonight was the smallest price she could pay to keep the people she loved safe. The address in the message led to an old brick building on the south side of the city, outwardly the office of a property management company, the sort of cover men like Harlan Voss had always preferred. 2 men standing in the lobby started to raise their hands to stop the unannounced visitor, but then, They saw clearly the face of the man who had just stepped through the rain-streaked glass door, and both of them made the wisest decision of their lives. They stood still. In this city, some names were a passport all by themselves. Enzo walked past them without slowing for even a heartbeat, rainwater still dripping from the shoulders of his coat onto the stone floor. The file pressed tightly beneath his arm, and he pushed open the heavy wooden door at the end of the hallway, at the precise moment when, had he arrived 10 seconds later, nothing could have been saved. The room beyond was warm with yellow light and cold with the smell of stale cigar smoke. Behind a broad wooden desk sat Harlan Voss in a gray suit, his silver hair combed back, his deeply lined face wearing the patience of a man who had spent his entire life waiting for debtors. And in front of him, perched on the edge of a leather chair far too large for her slight frame, sat Callie. She was bent over a sheet of paper spread flat across the desk, the pen in her right hand already touching the page, its tip only a breath away from the signature line. The sound of the opening door made her look up, and for one moment, every emotion crossed her face: shock, shame, panic, and then something that tightened Enzo's chest, a pleading desperation, as though she feared he had come to stop her from doing the only thing left in her life that still carried meaning. "You shouldn't be here," she blurted, her voice breaking. "This has nothing to do with you. I'm taking care of it. Please go home." Enzo didn't answer her. His gaze settled on the man behind the desk, and Voss, to his credit, was a seasoned player. He didn't show confusion for even a second. He leaned back in his chair, laced his 10 fingers together, and spoke first in a deep, rough voice, polished smooth by 30 years of negotiations conducted in the dark. "Mr. Caruso, what an unexpected honor. Miss Sutton is voluntarily resolving a personal financial obligation, entirely of her own free will. Perhaps you should respect the decision of an adult." Every word had been placed exactly where it belonged, like pieces on a chessboard. Voluntary, personal, adult. Traps made of language, waiting for Enzo to lose his temper so they could spring shut. But Enzo Caruso hadn't come there to lose his temper. He walked forward slowly, pulled out the empty chair beside Callie but didn't sit, merely resting one hand against its back, the gesture of a man who intended to remain as long as necessary. Then he placed the file on the wooden desk, neatly aligned beside the debt acknowledgement, and pushed it toward Voss with 2 fingers. "Before she signs anything," he said, his voice as calm as though they were discussing a shipment of wine, "I think you should read this. Consider it a courtesy between men who both understand the rules." Voss studied the file for a moment, then opened it with the indulgent expression of a superior humoring someone beneath him. But Enzo watched his eyes, and he saw the exact moment that indulgence died. The first page contained the forensic conclusion bearing the seal of an expert who had once worked for the courts. The signature carrying Callie Sutton's name on the loan agreement was a copied fabrication. The strokes had been traced slowly, the pressure was unnaturally uniform, and the writing was inconsistent with every genuine sample belonging to the woman named on the document. The second page contained the analysis of the blank paper, and this was where the old man's fingers stopped against the report. The paper type, its weight, and the Raven watermark on the loan contract matched perfectly with the paper stock from the internal print shop used by Voss's own network. The room became so quiet that the murmur of rain beyond the windows could be heard. Callie looked from the report to Enzo, her lips parting, the pen in her hand lowering without her even realizing it, because she was beginning to understand, layer by layer, that the debt which had crushed 2 years of her life had never been real, that the signature wasn't hers not because of some miracle, but because it had been manufactured from the beginning, inside the machinery of the very man sitting before her. Voss closed the file slowly and looked up with a smile that had grown visibly thinner. "Documents can be forged, Mr. Caruso," he said. "Even forensic reports." "Yes," Enzo replied with a nod. "They certainly can. That's why I'm not taking this to court." He drew the file back toward himself, straightened the edges of the pages, and for the first time since entering the room, sat in the chair beside Callie, as comfortably as though he were in his own office. "I intend to do something far worse," he continued in the same even voice. "I intend to send a copy to every person in our world, to the bookmakers who exchange money through you, to the families who have allowed the Raven to conduct business, and to every major debtor considering whether to sign another agreement with your system. You understand this better than I do, Mr. Voss. In our world, money isn't blood. Reputation is blood. People sign with the Raven because they believe the Raven is merciless but fair. Now imagine the entire city learning that the Raven prints false debts in his own workshop and traces the signature of an orphaned waitress so he can collect money that was never borrowed. No one will declare war on you. Beginning tomorrow, they simply won't sign with you anymore. And a lending empire, as you know better than anyone, doesn't die from a lack of money. It dies when no one believes in it. Enzo paused, allowing the silence to do its work, then concluded in a voice that was almost courteous. Or, right now, you tear up that document. The debt that never existed disappears as though it had never existed. Miss Sutton walks out of here a free woman, and the story of your printing operation remains locked inside my safe, as a courtesy between two men who understand the rules. You have 2 choices, and 1 minute. I'm not threatening you, Mr. Voss. I'm simply giving you the price list. The 2 men stared at each other across the wooden desk, and Callie, seated between them with the pen now cold in her hand, witnessed for the first time in her life a true battle from the underworld. There were no roars, no fists, and not a single drop of blood, only 2 pairs of eyes and 1 truth laid upon a table, yet its weight made the air in the room so dense that breathing became difficult. She looked at the silver-haired man who had held her fate in his hands only moments before, and saw something on that seasoned face she had never seen there, the calculation of a man who was losing. The full minute didn't need to pass. Voss reached for the debt acknowledgement lying before Callie, lifted it to eye level as though regretting the loss of a beautiful hand of cards, then tore it in half, tore it again, and let the pieces fall across the desk. Let us consider the debt never purchased, he said dryly. And from this moment forward, this woman doesn't owe my system a single dollar. Enzo rose and fastened the button of his coat, still damp from the rain. A wise decision, he said, then added one final sentence, as light as a farewell nod and as cold as a boundary carved into stone. As for my father's restaurant and the people inside it, I trust that beginning tonight, we understand one another. Voss didn't answer, and his silence was answer enough. Enzo turned toward Callie and held out his hand. Still unable to believe the scraps of paper scattered across the desk, she placed her cold hand in his. He closed his fingers around it, steady and warm, and helped her rise from the leather chair that had been far too large for her. Together, they walked out of the room, through the hallway, past the 2 guards still standing as motionless as statues, and into the Chicago rain, which had begun to soften. Neither of them looked back. Outside, the city continued moving through its Thursday night. Restaurants glowing with light, the last buses making their routes, millions of people entirely unaware, because some battles that decide the fate of a single life, and sometimes an entire territory, end without anyone beyond 3 people in one room ever knowing they happened. The black sedan brought them back to Il Faro after midnight had passed over the city. Throughout the drive, Callie sat silently in the passenger seat, both hands resting in her lap, glancing down at them from time to time, as though she still couldn't believe they would never again have to sign another piece of paper. Enzo didn't take her back to the laundromat. With the instinct of a man who had survived the longest nights of his own life, he understood that there were nights when no one should be left alone, and when the car stopped outside the restaurant with every light along its facade already extinguished, she didn't ask why. He opened the rear entrance and led her through the kitchen, and instead of allowing darkness to cover the rows of stainless steel tables as it did every night, he reached out and turned on every light. The kitchen glowed, clean and warm, and the place where not long ago she had sat crying alone in the darkness while her phone repeatedly lit up on the floor was now filled with soft golden light. Enzo placed a kettle on the stove, took down 2 cups, and prepared 2 servings of hot tea with unhurried movements. Then he pulled 2 chairs close to the steel table in the center of the kitchen, where the head chef usually stood during the day to arrange the plates. They sat facing each other, steam rising between them, and he asked nothing. He only remained there, as patient as he had been throughout the past several weeks, and that silence, which demanded nothing from her in the brightly lit kitchen, accomplished what no question ever could. Callie held the warm cup between both hands, watched the thin steam drift upward, and began to speak. Her voice hesitant at first, then gradually becoming steadier, like water finally finding a path after being dammed for 2 years. My father left when I was little and never came back, she said, simply, without bitterness, as though describing rain that had stopped long ago. After that, it was only my mother and me. My mother was a nurse, as you already know. She worked day shifts and night shifts. Sometimes an entire week passed, and I only saw her when she came home to exchange one uniform for another. But I never felt that anything was missing, because she had a way of making even the humblest dinner feel like a feast. A faint smile touched her face at the memory, and Enzo realized it was the first time she had spoken of her past without fear casting a shadow through her eyes. "I used to dream of becoming a teacher," she continued. "I was accepted into an education program and studied for nearly 2 years. I still remember practicing lessons in front of the mirror, imagining a classroom filled with children." Then she stopped, looked down into her tea, and her voice dropped lower. "When I was 20, my mother's kidneys began to fail. The doctor said she needed regular dialysis 3 times a week, and I sat in the hospital corridor that day and made a simple calculation. Tuition on one side, medical bills on the other, and the strength of one person between them. I deferred my studies, and then the deferral became leaving school altogether. No one forced me, so please don't think that. My mother even cried and begged me not to quit. But a woman who had spent her entire life bandaging strangers couldn't be left with no one to bandage her. 3 years, she said. For 3 years, I worked every job I could find. I helped at a diner in the mornings, took my mother to the hospital in the afternoons, and brought bookkeeping home to do at night. And do you know the strangest thing? Those were the 3 years when I felt closest to her. On the bus rides to the hospital, she told me about the patients she had cared for, people whose names she had never shared with anyone. She said, "Sweetheart, my work taught me one thing. People remember for a very long time those who were kind to them when they were at their weakest." Callie paused and took a sip of tea, and Enzo saw her fingers tighten around the cup as she reached the part he knew would be the hardest. "Then my mother couldn't keep fighting," she said softly. 2 years ago, the day she died, they handed me a stack of hospital bills as thick as a book, and I sat in that small hospital room signing page after page with a hand that trembled so badly the employee had to show me where to sign again. I walked out through the hospital gates that day, burdened by a mountain of unpaid medical bills and with no one left in the world. No father, no mother, no brothers or sisters. My friends from college had already moved into lives of their own long before then. I was 25 years old, and I was completely alone. And that was when Wade appeared. She looked up at Enzo, as though she needed him to understand the full weight of that moment before he judged her. He started coming to the diner where I worked. Every week, he always sat at one of my tables and always left a kind thank you behind. Then there were flowers, messages asking whether I had eaten, and afternoons when he waited outside the diner just to walk me to the bus stop. For someone who had just lost everything, do you know how much those small things could mean? I believed life had sent him to make up for what it had taken away. For the first 6 months, he was the most thoughtful man I had ever known. Then, little by little, everything changed color, so slowly that I didn't realize I was retreating. He wanted to know where I was every hour. When he called, I had to answer before the 3rd ring. He wanted to read my messages because people who truly loved one another had nothing to hide. If I came home 10 minutes late, I had to explain. If I wore a new blouse, I had to explain. And every time I tried to resist, he apologized more beautifully than anyone in the world. And I told myself he was only afraid of losing me because I had once lost everyone. She shook her head slowly and gave a laugh without the slightest trace of joy. By the time I found enough courage to end it, it was already too late. One morning, I opened my mailbox and found the first notice about a loan in my name, bearing my signature and my social security number. A loan I had never signed. I called him, and in that same sweet voice, he told me to go ahead and try telling someone, because no one would believe me. You already know the rest. The kitchen fell silent, leaving only the sound of the kettle slowly cooling on the stove. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Enzo asked quietly. "For 2 years, not one person." Callie looked directly into his eyes, and her answer came slowly, one word at a time, as though she had repeated it to herself thousands of times through sleepless nights. "I stayed silent because I was afraid everyone would ask why I had been so foolish. Why did I trust someone like that? Why did I let it go so far? Why didn't I see it sooner? And there was something I feared even more. I was afraid of becoming a burden. People feel sorry for you once, maybe twice, but by the 10th time, they grow tired, and they leave. I'm used to losing the people I love, Enzo. I couldn't survive losing anyone else, so I chose not to let anyone come close in the first place." Enzo remained still until she had spoken the final word. Then he set down his cup, leaned forward slightly, enough for her to see his gray eyes clearly beneath the light, and spoke in a slow, steady voice that carried no pity, only the certainty of a man declaring something he believed absolutely. "Callie, listen to me. Trusting the wrong person isn't a crime. The fault belongs to the man who turned your kindness into a trap. You aren't foolish. You were simply kind among people who weren't worthy of that kindness, and that has never, not for a single day, been your fault." Callie looked at him, her lips trembling, and this time she didn't raise a hand to wipe the tears away as she always had before. She allowed them to fall in the brightly lit kitchen, because for the first time in 2 years, they weren't tears of fear. They were the tears of someone who had finally felt another person lift away the stone she had believed she would have to carry for the rest of her life. When the tears had finally subsided, and the tea in both cups had grown only lukewarm, Callie sat quietly for a long while. Then, as though suddenly remembering something, she raised a hand to her neck and removed the silver necklace. Enzo had never once seen her without during the past 14 months. She laid it in her palm, looked at it with the tenderness people reserved for someone they loved, and said softly, "I want to show you something. I've spent the whole night telling you about my mother, but I haven't shown you her face." Her fingers found the tiny clasp along the side of the teardrop-shaped pendant, which Enzo had always assumed was nothing more than a smooth piece of silver, and the pendant opened in half like a miniature book. Inside was a small photograph faded with time, cut to fit perfectly within the silver frame, showing a middle-aged woman in a pale blue nurse's uniform, her hair gathered into a low bun at the back of her neck, smiling at the person behind the camera with such gentleness that warmth seemed to radiate from the picture itself. "This is my mother," Callie said. "It was taken at the hospital, a few years before she became ill. I've always thought this photograph looked more like the person she truly was than any other." She gently pushed the pendant across the steel table toward him, and Enzo Caruso lowered his eyes to that tiny photograph, and then the entire kitchen, the faint murmur of rain still lingering beyond the walls, the whole world around him, came to a stop. He could no longer hear what Callie was saying. He was somewhere else, in a hospital corridor 11 years earlier, on the highest floor of the palliative care wing, where the smell of disinfectant mingled with the scent of flowers someone had forgotten, where a 23-year-old young man named Enzo had spent the final nights sitting beside the bed of a father whose life was slowly draining away. During those months, the entire city had held its breath and waited for the old boss to close his eyes. The men beneath him came to visit with calculation written across their faces. His enemies sent flowers with condolence cards prepared in advance. The doctors spoke to his father with the caution of people touching a bomb. Everyone who entered that room carried either fear or an agenda. Everyone saw the Caruso name before they saw an old man dying. Everyone except one person. A nurse from the ward, no longer young, with her hair gathered into a low bun, stopped by the room at the end of every shift, carrying a bowl of hot soup she had warmed herself in the ward kitchen, because she said the old man complained that the hospital food was always too cold. She never knocked timidly. She never bowed or acted submissive, and she was never curious. She adjusted his father's pillow, gently scolded him when he hid his medicine beneath his tongue, told him small stories about the day unfolding beyond the window, and called him by his given name, rather than by the family name the whole city whispered. Once, Enzo had stood outside the door and heard his father, a man who had trusted no one throughout his life, ask whether she knew who he was. The nurse continued tucking the blanket around him, and answered as lightly as though the question meant nothing. "On this floor, sir, everyone is simply a human being who needs care." And the old man had laughed, the most peaceful and uncommon laugh of his final months. On one of the last nights, his father held Enzo's hand and whispered many instructions about the family, the empire, and the names he must be wary of, but his final instruction had nothing to do with any game of power. He said, "I've met countless men who knelt because they feared me, and only a few who treated me kindly without needing to know who I was. Remember this, son. That is the rarest thing in the world. If one day you encounter that kindness again, anywhere, in any form, don't let it be made to suffer." After the funeral, Enzo had sent someone back to the hospital to find that nurse and thank her, but she had transferred to another ward, then another hospital, and life had carried everyone in different directions. He had never even learned her name. For 11 years, that face had rested quietly in a corner of his memory, until tonight, when it smiled at him from inside a silver pendant in the kitchen of his own father's restaurant. "Enzo?" Callie called softly. "What's wrong?" Enzo looked up, and Callie froze, because the gray eyes of the most powerful man she had ever known, eyes usually as calm as steel, were red with tears. It took him a moment to find his voice again. "Your mother?" he asked slowly, each word moving as carefully as a footstep across thin ice. "Did she ever work in palliative care? About 11 years ago?" Callie blinked in surprise and nodded. "Yes. She worked there for several years before transferring to a hospital closer to home." "How did you know?" And Enzo told her. He spoke in a voice he had never used with anyone before, telling her about the corridor on the highest floor, about the old boss feared by an entire city who had become small and frail inside a wasted body, about the bowls of hot soup at the end of every shift, about the only nurse who called his father by his given name, about the answer that on this floor everyone was simply a human being, and about his father's final instruction from the hospital bed, that if Enzo ever encountered that kindness again, he must never allow it to suffer. The more he told her, the more Callie's hands began to tremble. Pieces of two lives that had seemed entirely separate were joining before her eyes. She remembered the bus rides to the hospital, and the stories her mother had told about patients whose names she never revealed. "There's one very difficult old man, sweetheart. He complains that his food is cold, but I feel sorry for him, because everyone in the ward is afraid of him, and no one is willing to stay and listen when he speaks." Callie began to cry, but this time, in the brightly lit kitchen, it was no longer the kind of crying she had to smother into her palm as she had on that fateful night. These weren't tears of fear or wounded pride. She cried the way people cried when they discovered they had never been as orphaned as they believed, when they realized that a mother long gone was still reaching out to protect them from somewhere far away, through a bowl of hot soup she had once warmed for a stranger 11 years earlier. Two people sat across from each other in the kitchen, a boss and a waitress, and suddenly understood that an invisible thread had bound them together long before either knew the other existed, that the night he heard her crying behind the kitchen door hadn't been the beginning of this story. It had only been the middle of a circle drawn long ago by two people who were no longer alive. Enzo reached across the table, gently closed the pendant, placed it in Callie's palm, and folded her fingers around it with great care. Then he spoke in a voice deep and certain, like a vow carved into stone, the words that completed a circle 11 years in the making. "Tonight, you watched the debt bearing your name be torn apart, but I want you to understand something even greater. Every debt you have ever carried, whether real or false, whether written on paper or held inside your heart, was paid by your mother a very long time ago, through bowls of hot soup no one asked her to make, through kindness given without needing to know the name of the person receiving it, and through raising someone like you." Winter came quietly to Chicago that year, covering the city in bitter mornings and early sunsets that painted the rooftops of River North in gold, and 3 months passed after the night in the brightly lit kitchen, 3 months in which the greatest changes revealed themselves through the smallest things. Wade Mercer left Chicago during the first week of December, without ceremony or farewell, exactly as defeated men usually left. Gideon's people reported that after the night in the office on the South Side, Harlan Voss had removed Wade's name from every arrangement, and the gambling debt he had once been promised would disappear in exchange for all those nights spent waiting outside in the rain, returned to his shoulders in full, principal, and interest, along with creditors who no longer had any reason to be patient. The man who had spent 2 years digging a hole for the young woman who had once trusted him finally fell into that same hole himself, not because of Enzo's hand, not because of any act of revenge, but because of the oldest law of justice, the one Enzo's father had always called the law of the hole. Enzo could have made things far worse for Wade with nothing more than a nod, and Gideon had once asked him directly about it over their morning coffee, but Enzo only shook his head. "Revenge is the language of a man who hasn't truly won," he said. "The only thing I want is a boundary." And that boundary was established in the cleanest way possible, through the family's law office, with a restraining order approved by the court based on a thick file documenting 2 years of harassment, prohibiting Wade Mercer from coming near Callie Sutton, near Il Faro, or near the life he no longer had any right to touch. There was no spectacle and no noise, only a sheet of paper bearing an official seal. But it was the first piece of paper in Callie's life that had ever stood on her side. As for Callie, her healing didn't arrive in a single morning when she opened her eyes. It came little by little, like melting snow, through details only someone who had watched her with Enzo's attention would have noticed. She no longer looked over her shoulder when walking to the bus stop on evenings when no restaurant car was available to take her home. The steps that had once been hurried and bowed were slower now, and on some days, she even stopped before the window of an old bookstore, something the woman she had been only months earlier would never have allowed herself to do on a crowded street. The phone in her pocket rarely vibrated anymore, and the miracle wasn't found in its silence, but in the fact that on the rare occasions when it did vibrate, she took it out and looked at the screen calmly, read a message from the manager about a schedule change, or from a classmate asking about an assignment, smiled as she replied, then slipped the phone back into her pocket with an almost weightless movement. The vibration that had once sounded like fear knocking at her door was now only the vibration of a telephone. And some of the greatest victories in this world were measured by things as ordinary as that. At the beginning of January, when universities opened registration for the spring semester, Callie stood for a long time outside the gates of the college she had left 7 years earlier, then drew a deep breath and stepped inside to register for the education program again, taking morning classes and beginning with the unfinished credits left behind by the 20-year-old student she had once been. She told her coworkers during a family meal, speaking with the embarrassed tone of someone confessing an impossible dream, and the entire table applauded until her face turned red all the way to her ears. She didn't tell Enzo. She had planned to wait for a more formal occasion, but the following week, when the new monthly schedule was posted, she saw that her name had been placed neatly into the late afternoon shifts, leaving every weekday morning open, without a word of explanation or a single notice. She stood before the schedule for a while, understanding, then looked up toward the second-floor office window, where the light was still burning. She didn't go upstairs to knock and thank him, and Enzo, who certainly knew that she had understood, never mentioned it, not even in half a sentence. A wordless language had formed between them, because both understood what people who had survived storms eventually learned, that some acts of kindness didn't need to be named, and naming them sometimes made them smaller. Then, on a Saturday afternoon near the end of January, while snow drifted softly beyond the large windows of Il Faro, Enzo came down from the second floor and stopped at the foot of the stairs before a scene that held him motionless for a long time. In a corner of the restaurant, Callie was training a new waitress, and they were standing beside table number 9. The familiar silver-haired woman had returned as she did every weekend, and Callie was speaking to the new employee in a voice both gentle and clear. "Remember this," she said. "She likes her soup a little hotter than usual, so make sure the kitchen knows, and always bring an extra napkin for her to place beneath her water glass. She won't ask for it, but she needs it. You'll know that when you pay attention." The new waitress nodded and wrote it down. The elderly woman looked up and said something that made them both laugh, and Callie laughed with them, a full and easy laugh that illuminated her entire face, without the slightest trace of the polite smile built from sheer endurance that Enzo had grown accustomed to seeing throughout her first 14 months at Il Faro. He stood at the foot of the stairs, watching the young woman who had once collapsed from hunger inside this very restaurant, now passing on to someone else, the lesson her mother had passed on to her, the quiet tenderness of noticing the people the world hurried past. And he suddenly understood that the circle begun by the nurse all those years ago had never truly closed. It was only growing wider, silently, from a bowl of hot soup in a hospital to a bowl of extra hot soup at table number 9, from a mother to a daughter, and now to a young woman just beginning her first job, carefully writing every word into a small notebook. Outside, winter continued covering the city in snow, but behind the glowing windows of Il Faro, something had melted completely, and it would never freeze again. During those 3 winter months, there was one night that everyone at Il Faro would later remember as a milestone, the restaurant's Christmas party. It was a tradition that had begun in the days of Enzo's father, the one evening of the year when the restaurant hung a closed sign for customers so it could open its doors to the people who made it what it was. And like the family meal, that tradition had slept unnoticed through the years when Il Faro operated like a flawless machine. This year, it was awakened. From the afternoon onward, the first floor was transformed. Rows of tables were joined into one long table, covered with a red cloth that stretched through the heart of the restaurant. The head chef and his entire kitchen team prepared dishes of their own choosing, foods from their homelands, from childhood, from recipes that would never appear on the menu. Near the large window, a real Christmas tree stood upright, fragrant with pine resin, glowing with warm lights and red ornaments that the waitresses had competed to hang throughout the afternoon. Beyond the glass, snow began falling at dusk. Large, slow flakes, drifting through the halos of the streetlights, like something from an old Christmas card. Employees arrived with their families, husbands and wives, seeing for the first time the place where the people they loved spent their working days. And children came too. The kitchen assistants' children, the manager's grandchildren, the cashier's two younger sisters. They rushed into the restaurant like a flock of sparrows, their cheeks pink from the cold, their eyes shining when they saw the tree. All evening, the bright chatter of children became the loveliest music the dining room had ever known. They ran around the tree counting ornaments. They cried out in delight when the head chef, the largest and most serious man in the restaurant, emerged from the kitchen wearing a red hat and carrying a basket of presents, then crouched down to hand one to each child, calling every child by name because he had taken the trouble to ask their parents beforehand. The children hugged their gift boxes and bounced with excitement, making everyone at the long table laugh until they nearly leaned into one another. Later, parents were seen taking their children by the hand to the large window and pointing out the snow falling over the street. Tiny palms pressed against the glass, and clear young voices called out, "Look, snow, look, snow," while one child was lifted onto his father's shoulders so he could better see the flakes settling on the awning. Enzo sat somewhere near the middle of the long table, not at its head, never at its head during gatherings like this, and he watched it all with the strange feeling of a man who had just found something he hadn't known he had lost. Then he saw Callie. She arrived slightly late, because her morning class had been followed by an afternoon study session, and when she stepped through the door and gently brushed the snow from the shoulders of her coat, the entire table turned and called her name, as though welcoming home the youngest member of the family. She wore a simple dark blue wool dress, the only clothing other than her uniform that her coworkers had ever seen her wear. Her hair was loose instead of tied low, and at her throat, resting against the blue wool, the small silver pendant glowed softly beneath the golden lights. She took the place everyone had saved for her between the cashier and the kitchen assistant. And throughout the meal, Enzo kept finding his eyes drawn in that direction, not because he was worried as he had been in the months before, but for a reason far simpler. Looking at her now gave him joy. The Callie of that night served food to the person beside her, threw back her head and laughed aloud at one of the manager's stories, rose to help a little girl retrieve a fallen ornament, then crouched to the child's eye level and listened as she proudly showed off her present. She did all of it freely and naturally, without freezing for even a second, without glancing toward the door a single time, without her shoulders tightening at an unexpected sound. And Enzo, who had watched her long enough to read even the smallest sign, understood exactly what he was witnessing. It wasn't a life made perfect. Her life still held classes she had to pass, bills she had to pay, and wounds that needed time. It was something more precious than perfection. Fear no longer had the right to make decisions for her. She laughed when she wanted to laugh, sat where she wanted to sit, arrived late without apologizing 3 times, and tonight she was here not because she was afraid to go home, but because this was where she wanted to be. Near the end of the meal, when the head chef carried out a chocolate log cake, and the children cried out once more, Enzo looked up and met Gideon's eyes from the far end of the long table. The old soldier sat beside his wife. He had come with her, something that hadn't happened at any family gathering in 10 years, and across the full length of the red-covered table, beyond the laughing faces and the flickering candlelight, Gideon quietly raised his wineglass toward Enzo. It was a small, wordless gesture, yet it carried everything the reserved man wished to say. "Your father can see all of this, and he is pleased." Enzo lifted his glass in return, then slowly let his gaze travel around the room. He looked at the long table where his people were talking and laughing together, at the glowing tree and the children comparing gifts beneath it, at the head chef in his red hat, at the snow beyond the glass falling like a white curtain around them all, and at the young woman in the blue dress laughing among everyone. For 11 years, Enzo had preserved Il Faro as though preserving an inheritance, running it with perfect precision as a promise to the man who was gone. But it wasn't until that night, amid the laughter of children, the scent of baked food, and the eyes of a young woman who was no longer afraid, that Enzo Caruso looked at his father's restaurant and saw it finally become what his father had always wanted it to be. Not a business, not a symbol, but a home. While the party inside was still alive with laughter, and someone had begun playing old Christmas songs, Enzo noticed that the chair where the woman in the blue dress had been sitting was empty, and through the glass, he saw her standing on the small second-floor balcony, overlooking the street slowly disappearing beneath the snow. He took his coat with him, stepped outside, and placed it around her shoulders, as he had once done on a very different night in the rain. She accepted it with a faint smile without turning around, as though she had known he would come. They stood beside each other in silence, the kind of silence they both now understood as a place of shelter, rather than an empty space, watching the snowflakes drift slowly through the halos of the streetlights, before dissolving into the golden glow below, where the city continued through another winter night, unaware of everything that had unfolded within its heart over the past several months. Then Callie spoke, her voice so soft that it seemed she was afraid of breaking something. "Do you know, this morning I walked to work without looking behind me even once. Not a single time. I didn't realize it until midday, and I had to stop in the middle of the campus for a while just to believe it was true. It has been almost 2 years since I had a day like that." Enzo looked at her face beneath the balcony light, tiny snowflakes resting in her hair like wandering stars, and said, "Then today is worth celebrating." She gave a quiet laugh, a sound touched by tears, then turned fully toward him, and inside her hazel eyes was everything she had carried through the journey behind her. The nights she had cried alone in the dark kitchen, the crumpled envelope in her apron, the resignation letter, the old Raven's office, and the brightly lit kitchen where a silver pendant had been opened. "You gave me my life back," she said. Enzo slowly shook his head and answered in the deep, certain voice of a man speaking something he believed without question. "No, Callie. Listen to me. You took it back yourself. You were the one who stood again every time life brought you down. You were the one who went to work every day with a smile on your face while carrying an entire storm on your shoulders. You were the one brave enough to walk into the Raven's nest simply to protect the people you loved. I never gave you anything you didn't already possess. I only reminded you of something you had forgotten, that you didn't have to do all of it alone." Callie looked at him for a long time while the snow continued falling between them. Then she extended her hand and placed it in his. Her cold fingers found warmth, and Enzo closed his hand around hers, steady and gentle, not with the grip of possession, but with a promise that needed no words, a promise that from that moment forward, kindness would always have strength standing beside it, that the gentleness of this world would never again have to walk through darkness alone. They remained that way for a long time, their hands joined above the snow-covered railing, while the city below continued with its life. Glowing windows, late buses, millions of people carrying millions of stories, none of them aware that the greatest victories in a human life are rarely announced. They happen quietly, inside the hearts of people who finally stop merely surviving and begin truly living. And that night, standing in the falling snow beside the woman who had taught him the greatest lesson of his life, Enzo Caruso understood something 10 years of power had never been able to teach him, that true power is never measured by the number of people who feel fear when they hear a name. It is measured by the number of people who feel safe when they stand beside it. And the kindness we plant today, even when it is as small as a bowl of hot soup warmed by a nurse in a hospital many years ago, never disappears. It only travels quietly through the world until one day it returns to protect the people we love in the place we least expected. Because in the end, what remains after all the money and power are gone isn't what we forced others to give us, but what we willingly chose to give away. Dear friends, the story of Enzo and Callie ends here, and if this story touched your heart, please press the like button and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss the moving stories we bring to you every day. And don't forget to share this video with the people you love so that kindness can continue to spread. How did this story make you feel? What did you think about the kindness of Callie's mother, the nurse, about Callie's quiet sacrifices, or about the way Enzo chose to protect someone with his mind instead of his fists? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We sincerely hope to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. And don't forget to tell us which city you're listening from. Thank you for staying with us until the final moments of this video. We wish you and your family lasting health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and serenity. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.